Okay, I think we will get going now. We've got a few people on call, which is great. So if we go to the next slide, perfect. So let me introduce myself and then I'll introduce everyone else. So my name is Guy Battle. I'm the Chief Executive of Social Value Portal, but more importantly, I'm also the chair of the Environmental and Social Governance Committee for the BCO. I am joined today, firstly, by Simon Cox. Do you want to just introduce yourself, Simon?
Yeah, afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Simon Cox. I'm Head of Project Management and UK Sustainability Officer for PROLOGIS, a sort of owner, manager, developer of logistics buildings around the world.
Fantastic, thanks, Simon. And then Steve Malkin, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, thanks for having us here today. I'm Steve Malkin, CEO of Planet First. We are the custodians of a programme called the Planet Mark, which helps organisations cut carbon and achieve zero carbon status.
Fantastic, thanks Steve. And then finally, but definitely not least, we have Craig.
Afternoon everyone, it's great to be here today. So I'm Craig Jones. I am a consultant, body carbon assessment, carbon footprinting, life cycle assessment and carbon offsetting.
Fantastic. So now Steve has his door closed, we can properly start. Okay, so I've been looking forward to this, I have to say, as a discussion. We kicked off a debate at the ESG committee about 6 weeks ago, and it was kind of fiery, has to be said. It was fun, and there was definitely some controversy, and I think this is why we felt it was important to have this discussion, because as some of you will know, and I'm sure Steve will elucidate, offsetting is now a part of the accepted pathway to achieve net zero carbon. Now, offsetting for some is actually a dirty word, swear word even. But actually for those on the call, it definitely isn't. And I think what we want to do today is begin to unpick this, what I kind of see as a as the preconceptions, even a prejudice towards offsetting, if there was such a thing, and just sort of test it out. Now, I'm hoping that everyone will join in the debate. We do have a Q&A, so at the bottom of if you move your mouse around on Zoom, hopefully most of you are used to this by now, you can then put some Q&A in. So please feel free to Q&A. We've also got some polls, I think, later in the session, don't we? Or are we going to do those polls now, Bryony? Do you want to bring up the first set of polls before I introduce Steve? So we've got 4 questions here. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you ask these, so the first one is, do you have a zero carbon target? And the question is, if yes, what date are you looking to achieve zero carbon by? 2025, 2030, 2050, another date, or perhaps you don't. Then we've got the second question, have you been asked to deliver a zero carbon building? So this is kind of a test to the marketplace, I guess. Those professionals, and you might be developers as well, you might have set a target to achieve a zero carbon building. So, we just want to test the space. And then if you scroll down using the right-hand scroll key, you'll get to question 3, which is, do you think zero carbon should include both operational and embodied carbon? So the operational carbon is the energy used for lighting, heating, cooling. The embodied carbon is the carbon associated with the materials manufacture and principally the construction. So that's embodied carbon. So it's the total carbon footprint. So we're interested if you think it should be in-use carbon only, which is effectively the regulations, embodied carbon or both. And then the final question is, which most of you got to already, do you agree that offsetting should be part of achieving zero carbon? And that in itself is quite refreshing. It is not quite as tight as the presidential election at the moment, but it's looking 48% yes, just 17% no, but that's a healthy 20% no. And then the don't knows, perhaps the shy Democrats and Republicans waiting to decide until after this lecture. We are going to run that poll again at the end, so it'll be interesting to see if that 35%, the 11 people, have changed their mind to that 14, 6, 11. So look, that's kind of by way of a tee up. So if we go on to the next slide, so the order we're going to run is first off, I'm going to ask Steve to talk, and Steve kind of will lay the ground around building the case for offsetting. And then I'm going to ask Simon, and Simon's going to speak from a client perspective, developing lots of buildings, who uses an offsetting mitigation strategy, and it'd be interesting to hear his perspective. And then finally, we're going to hear from Craig, who's going to talk more specifically about the technical aspects of offsetting and what makes a good offset and a less good offset. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks ever so much, and thank you everyone for having this fascinating debate. It feels like a really, really important time. I'm going to go through at a fairly quick pace so we can get into the Q&A and dive into some of the detail, but I want to set the scene here, which is that everything I'm going to talk about will deliver business benefit. There is no doubt now that there is an absolute link between purpose, sustainability, zero carbon, and a whole myriad of business benefits, which you'll see on this slide. So I just want to say this is about good, great, strong business case for going for net zero carbon and the role of offsetting within that. Can we have the next slide, please? The other context piece, of course, is that we are 1 year into the decade of action. The UN recognizing this period between 2020 and 2030 is our opportunity once and for all to tackle the climate crisis and set it on the right trajectory, and also to tackle biodiversity loss and set that on the right trajectory as well. We're 1 year in, we have 9 years left. It's super urgent and absolutely necessary that we take very, very radical action. Thank you. Those are 2 context slides. Thanks. Can we have the next slide, please? As a reminder that to take that radical action, we are seeing transformation taking place all around us, and we know that our position here on the climate change chart is that this has to, change is happening very fast, and therefore we have to react to it extremely quickly. Next slide, thank you. And that's all about keeping ourselves within the boundaries of 1.5 degrees of heating that we also know. So the science is clear, and we understand now that we understand the science, and many, many other people also understand the science. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. And all around us, we're seeing the effects of climate change panning out and playing out, in our wonderful planet, but also we're seeing it in our society as well. So people are not only aware of the issue, they are taking action, and what they really, really want to see is change. And that has to happen very, very quickly. It's essential. Thanks. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. And that's playing out on a whole series of surveys that I'm sure you're aware of, but there's a couple of reminders here. 62% of people believe the government is not doing enough in tackling and preventing climate change. 71% want to see more investment in renewable energy. 60% of people would like battery storage in their own homes, but only 2% have it installed. And 71% believe in effectively the producer pays. There is a producer responsibility, which here is the fuel companies should effectively start to cough up and sort out the effects of climate change. So there is an expectation that action is happening and people want change. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. And we're seeing it around us. There is a lot of good news. Hopefully we get good news today of further shores, but in the UK here, we're weaning off fossil fuels. We're growing our economic recovery through Build Back Better. And there is a green recovery plan, and we're seeing all sorts of brands taking action in and around reducing carbon and actually tackling zero carbon. Can I have the next slide? And some of our work, it also goes into government level. So we're seeing more and more zero carbon neutral plans being put into government level, into policy, into legislation, and into law. So that's the backdrop, is that zero carbon is now out there from a legal perspective, from government level. Thank you. Can I have the next slide? And we're seeing that in the organisations that we work with. Here a smattering of some that we work with in the Planet Mark. Some of you know, some of you won't. These companies, and can you just press the button once more? Thanks. The results are absolutely incredible for organisations who are measuring and reducing carbon. 12% annual reduction in absolute carbon will put us on to at least a 50% reduction by 2030, which is the very least that we can achieve and we should be aiming for. So the issue here is If 99% of companies can actually reduce carbon radically in a scale, why would we not all be setting zero carbon targets? Can I have the next slide? Thanks. And we've seen from just last week, 200 organisations associated with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development put in zero carbon targets. They might be towards 2050 in the longer term view, but they must put those plans into place and into play within the next 2 years. So these 200 organisations, big corporates like Shell, BP, Enron, and so on, have to put their carbon targets and net zero targets into the public domain within the next 2 years. That's a public commitment to net zero. So things are moving really, really fast from a corporate level, from a company level. And if you're operating any type of office space where these companies might be, then there's going to be expectation that real estate across the board will have to go net zero. Thank you. Next slide. So what does that mean to construction? So the UK GBC have set out their sort of hierarchy, if you like, about how to deal with net zero. And it is these 5 steps here, which I'm sure you're sort of aware of. But if you look at the 5th one, it is absolutely, if you just press the button once more, just so everyone sees it, there is a role for carbon offsetting here. Once you have tackled these other issues, and I think it's worth looking at the first 4 steps in terms of you establish a net zero carbon scope, you reduce your construction impacts, you reduce operational energy and carbon impacts, you deploy renewable energy where you possibly can in your supply chain and on site, but whatever is left, and there will be carbon left, has to use offsets to tackle that. That's the UK GBC view on how to do it, and that is at this moment in time the most practical view. Can I have one more slide, please? It's also set out in their code of practice around how to get to net zero, and there's two issues here. Number one is that they need to deploy renewable energy on site. And if you press the button once more, there is an issue here. On-site renewable energy is extremely difficult to make work in terms of the scale that needs to be deployed, which therefore inevitably leads you to deal with the remaining carbon by offsetting. And if you press the button once more, thanks. So we understand there are sort of issues around offsetting. I think actually anyone who's been through that early period of offsetting back in the early 2000s probably has some degree of hangover with it. Well, in actual fact, life is really, really different now. In actual fact, you have got great quality, excellent standard offsets with a high degree of rigor and great visibility, which Craig will talk to you about in a moment. Can I have one more slide? Thank you. So just as a reminder about what you must do before you offset, you need to be looking at your site, you look at your site boundary, you look at the building, then the development that you're delivering, and you conduct a life cycle assessment, which carries over both embodied carbon and operational carbon. You find ways and means to reduce that carbon. Thanks. Can I have one more slide? And then you can lay out exactly what you're achieving. Simon, this is one of your graphs. I hope you don't mind me using it, but this is what PROLOGIS has achieved over many, many projects that we've run with them, which I think is over 60 developments now. We look at a notional baseline, you reduce your operational and your embodied carbon, you offset the remainder, and then you engage the occupier on a continuous program of reducing carbon and hopefully achieving zero carbon. If you press the slide button once more, that's the embodied carbon and operational carbon reduction that you must achieve. And if you press it once more, this is the bit with the embodied carbon that has to be effectively offset to cut carbon as radically and as hard and fast as you can and offset the remainder. Thank you. One more slide. The way that PROLOGIS choose to do this, and I thought I'd just show a picture because I'm not quite sure if someone will be talking or showing a picture. What PROLOGIS have chosen to do is mitigate their carbon type of offsetting by protecting rainforest at scale. So there is huge, wider benefit, socioeconomic benefit from the simple carbon saving. I have another slide, thank you. So what does this mean? Just a quick summary. In terms of, look, we can't expect materials to reduce embodied carbon on their own. There are challenges around on-site or near-site renewable energy, but robust carbon offsetting can also have much, much wider social and economic benefits and lead into and weave into and align with and deliver against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So setting these targets right now about the decade of action is very, very urgent, and you can do it so it aligns with your business. I've got one more slide, I think. The great man has said this: humans are great problem solvers. We need to imagine a better future and work to create it. That is inevitably zero carbon. It's super urgent, and the case for offsetting is absolutely made, and we'd like to discuss today because it's a critical part of the process.
Great, thanks very much, Steve. And Steve, just a quick question. In terms of the boundary that has to be offset under the UK GBC, does it include embodied or is it just operational?
It's embodied carbon.
So it's embodied carbon for UK GBC, is it? So
Yeah, for construction, for net zero construction, you have to measure your embodied carbon.
And then you also the operational as well. So you've got to offset the whole lot.
Yeah.
Okay, Simon.
Great. So yeah, afternoon everybody. So I haven't got any slides, apologies. So you could just listen to me. But yeah, to introduce myself in a bit more detail. So I work for PROLOGIS. We describe ourselves as a global owner, manager and developer of logistics buildings. And we've got a portfolio of over 1 billion square feet now in 21 countries. And I think the statistic we started to use to sort of describe the scale of the business is that around 2.5% of global GDP in the form of goods passes through a PROLOGIS building at some point. So we really are a very sort of distributed large company and a global company in that sense. But my experience is with property development in the UK, and I'm responsible for procurement of all construction work and our associated sustainability strategy. And I wanted to sort of talk through what we sort of saw as the three key issues here. So firstly, what have we done to try and understand our environmental impact? Secondly, why have we come to the conclusion that for us embodied carbon is of particular importance? And then thirdly, what have we decided to do about it? So in terms of the environmental impact, as you'd expect for a big development company, we've got all sorts of sustainability metrics for new developments. One of those is life cycle assessments, which we've been doing since 2006. We've worked with the Sustainable Business Partnership doing that to recognise standards. We've developed our own database, I guess, in terms of the products and systems that we use. We've done this now for 57 developments, 23 million square feet of area, and we've recorded on average 22% carbon reduction. So that's physical reductions, and that's the blended number between embodied and operational. And that's equivalent to about 310,000 tons of carbon. And through that process, we've developed a really good idea of what, for us and the type of buildings we build, is and is not possible. Which brings me to the sort of second point, which is why embodied carbon is important to us. So first thing to figure out there, I guess, is that warehouses have got quite a low operational energy density. They are largely big open spaces without heating, just with lighting that are there to receive goods. And we've learned that we can just about halve our energy demand compared to building regulations just through good design. And I think we're right on a sort of tipping point now where we could move to a true zero carbon position in terms of operating energy use with on-site renewables. As Steve touched on, that's difficult because the most obvious technology for us is PV, and the biggest energy demand we have is lighting, and the timing of the two don't work. We're generating energy when we don't need it. And so we at the moment regularly run against a bit of a market failure in the energy industry because we end up having to export and import at different times. But I think that will get fixed in the next couple of years, and I think that sort of buildings we do will get to zero operational energy quite soon. Embodied carbon is much harder to tackle, and we over many years have looked at all sorts of weird and wonderful designs, so different materials, different structural forms. But actually what we need are very large span, very tall structures with very hard wearing level floor slabs. And whatever we do, we really come back to steel and concrete as being the best tools for the job, particularly when you look at the longevity of our buildings. And when we do our carbon life cycle assessments, we can regularly save 10 to 20% of embodied carbon through good design, and we have developed some particular successes there that have influenced our specifications. But actually, there is a point when using those particular materials, you struggle to go any further. And the thing that we recognized early on here is, we're a developer, so the embodied carbon is the bit that's most immediately in our control. It's the bit that we emit during the construction process, rather than the emissions that the occupier of the building is responsible for over many years. And those emissions, they are happening at year zero. So if you think about a kind of carbon bank account for a project, no matter how good the building is in terms of its operational energy performance, you've got a great big negative number at the beginning of the development as we release the embodied carbon, and then you've got gradual benefits through having a low carbon, low energy building over time. So what did we decide to do about that? So there's no regulatory reason for us to address embodied carbon. I mean, there's no requirement really for us to even measure it. So we got to this position voluntarily. And once we genuinely felt that we'd exhausted the opportunities for reduction, we turned to mitigation. And we made a decision to go for a partnership approach, working with Cool Earth as a charity rather than offsetting. But I mean, effectively, it's the same thing. We're outsourcing our carbon reduction. We're paying somebody to do something good somewhere else that makes up for an environmental harm that we cause and that we recognise here. What we do is we mitigate 5 times our embodied carbon footprint, and that was quite important to us. So we didn't want to stand still. We didn't want to just zero the clock. We wanted to make sure that we were doing some good. So for every ton of carbon that we emit as the residual embodied carbon footprint, we donate to Cool Earth and they avoid the emissions of 5 tons. And that program's been going on now for over 10 years. We've protected 14,000 acres of rainforest, and we've avoided the emissions of about 3.7 million tons. But also, and Steve's final slide touched on it, it goes beyond carbon for us. And Cool Earth, perhaps uniquely, I don't think it is that unique. The work that they do touches a lot of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so for us, we see benefits as well as carbon in protecting biodiversity, and in particular lifting local communities out of poverty, but helping them stay in the environment that they want to live in and maintain their way of life. So just to sum all of that up, over many years, we've learned really to understand our environmental impact, and we stared that in the face, and we've owned up to the fact that embodied carbon is our biggest issue and the one that we're going to find most difficult to tackle. We've decided to deal with it voluntarily through mitigation, choosing that charity partner route, which works really well for us. And I think our view is that it's almost a call to action of the businesses should do this. We want the industry to follow us. We want all of development, not just our logistics bits, to step up and do that sort of thing. It's not perfect, but there are clear environmental benefits. And if we hadn't done this, then the rainforest would have been destroyed. And so at the end of all of this, I think we can say there's an area of rainforest that's bigger than Manhattan Island in New York that is still standing today and will stand in the future because we chose to do something about the problem.
It's a nice.
That's it. Thank you.
I like that. Manhattan, is it all in Papua New Guinea? Is it in one place, or is it spread around the world?
So it's we've worked in 2 places. So we began our relationship with Cool Earth in Peru, in the Ashaninka region, but they became part of an initiative called the Queen's Commonwealth Canopy, which was working with the Queen and the Commonwealth Society to try and protect the world's rainforests. And Papua New Guinea was part of that initiative, so we shifted focus with them. And also Papua New Guinea is really interesting because it's in the arc of deforestation, but around palm oil. And so there's another different driver of deforestation there that's probably continued and been a bigger problem for us globally than sort of just logging for trees.
Okay,
so it's worked really well for us, and we want to continue it for the next 10 years to come.
Fantastic. We'll pick that up later. And just remind everyone to use the Q&A if you want to ask Simon or Steve or Craig after you present any questions, or pose any challenges to us as a panel. Would be great. Craig, it's all yours. Tell us all about offsetting.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. So I guess I've got the controversial bit is talking about carbon offsetting, and it is a controversial topic, and I think it's best to acknowledge that from the start, certainly if you're thinking of going in to use carbon offsets. Moving on to the next slide. I introduced myself before, maybe move on to the next slide. So when it comes to carbon offsetting, as you've seen from Stephen and Simon's talks, that it really is absolutely essential to reduce before offsetting. So reduction has to be plan A, that has to be done really well, and you have to put a lot behind the the efforts to reduce. Once you have done those efforts on reduction, that's when you should use carbon offsets. If you just want to skip straight to the carbon offsetting, that's where the problem comes, and that's where the whole thing gets a bad name out there. So that's paramount, and that's of course key on things such as the UK Green Building Council's net zero carbon framework and any good work in this area. Now, when it comes to what is a carbon offset, well, carbon offset's a carbon credit, and one credit is worth 1 tonne of carbon emission reduction. So a carbon credit is a carbon reduction of 1 tonne of CO2. And it's a way of funding carbon reductions through projects elsewhere. So they were originally created really for, like, the Kyoto Protocol, for wealthier countries to develop reductions in developing countries, and that's kind of stuck. So there are offset projects in the UK, America, and plenty of the developed countries, but the majority of the projects are in developing countries. And when I go through the wider benefits of the projects, I think you'll see that that's really where the wider kind of value of the projects kind of comes in. Now, to make sure that things are credible, there are various schemes, certification and verification schemes behind the carbon offsets. You can't just make up a ton of carbon credit and say that this is a carbon offset. There are these respected verification schemes. So we have the gold standard there. That's the world's second largest carbon offset scheme, and probably the most well respected around the world. We have verified carbon standard, VCS, that's the largest carbon offset scheme around the world, and also a very good, well respected offset scheme. Plan Vivo, they're a small offset scheme, an Edinburgh-based charity. They've been running for quite a long time. And then we've got things such as UK Woodland Code. Now, the UK Woodland Code is a UK-based tree planting carbon offset scheme backed by the UK government. But unfortunately, we can't use them for carbon neutrality, or let's say 99% of their credits can't be used for carbon neutrality. So lots of people want to use UK-based offsets to be carbon neutral. You can, but it's quite difficult. So all of those schemes, essentially, they're all there to add the requirements to make sure they're additional, so marginal carbon savings, they're verified, and they're traceable. Now, all of these schemes have their own kind of process to ensure that happens, and they have their own carbon offset registries. So each ton of carbon, if you like, has a serial number. And those organizations, Gold Standard, VCS, Plan Vivo, Woodland Code, they have carbon offset registries. When a client comes along and buys 1,000 tons of carbon, that tons of carbon will be retired on behalf of a client, and then that serial number of credits, that's gone, that's no longer available for sale. And that ensures that they can't be sold on any further there. Can we move to the next slide, please? Carbon, I've shown this simply the 3 pillars of sustainability, and carbon offsets can really help an organization to achieve objectives in any of the 3 pillars of sustainability beyond just environment. So of course you're there for the carbon emission reduction, but there are many wider social and economic benefits of the offset projects, and that's what attracted me to look into offset projects further, in that the better projects can really help fulfill benefits across the spectrum of the sustainability. Moving on, another really great way of, or seminal way now to represent sustainable development is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals have become a really great way of visualizing sustainability and targeting efforts in key areas. Now, any of the carbon offset projects available at the moment can achieve benefits in a number of these sustainable development goals. So you could target particular ones that are of interest to a company's CSR strategy, whether that's 4 quality education, 5 gender equality, 15 life on land. They can be built around the CSR objectives of an organization. Moving on, please. And again. So when it comes to examples of carbon offset projects, they are real projects on the ground. And I think that's something that isn't apparent when you only read perhaps the headlines of carbon offset stories, or the negative criticism, or you don't really get the detail of carbon offsets. So I've got some examples of some projects here. So these are quite popular carbon credits. It's clean cooking. And one of the reasons is because they have a really good story behind them. So around the world, about 3 billion people still cook on an open fire. Not only do they cook on an open fire, but quite a lot of those people are going to getting the fuel from chopping down trees and not getting replanted, or buying from someone that chopped down a tree and didn't replant. So it causes deforestation indirectly as well. The final thing here is a lot of them are cooking on those smog or dirty fuels in indoor environments. So it has a really indoor health kind of quality, poor indoor health quality to them. Now, what the Clean Cook Stove projects do is they will provide clean cooking equipment or build a community stove with either alternative fuels or one that reduces the fuel consumption. So often they'll reduce the consumption of fuel by 40, 50, 60% for the people. And these are typically in developing countries, so poor parts of the world. And the benefits here are that it can really save families a valuable part of their household income, because often they'll have to buy the fuel. It can save them time because the cooking is more efficient and it's quicker to boil the water or cook the food. And it's got benefits for indoor health quality and various nice social and wider environmental benefits there, reduced deforestation, etc. there. Now, I've put the UN Sustainable Development Goal benefits at the bottom there, and nowadays organisations like the Gold Standard and VCS will verify the benefits against the UN Sustainable Development Goals, adding an extra level of assurance that there are benefits for 3, good health and well-being, 5, gender equality, 7, affordable clean energy. So it adds a bit more behind these are the UN Sustainable Development Goal benefits here. Moving on, please. Clean water, these are also very popular credits. Some of them are similar to the Clean Cook Stoves because people often have to walk long distances, often women and children, to collect water. It's not necessarily a safe water resource, so when they do get back, they still have to boil them to purify the water. Now, this is a borehole rehabilitation program in Rwanda. This has a particular benefits for saving them time, and also because they don't have to boil the water, it saves them fuel, which saves them money, and then good themes around improving women's livelihoods there. Moving on to another project. Now, biogas carbon credits, these ones are quite interesting. I'm going to have to go to the next slide and then come back. If we go to the next slide. So these carbon credits, this one's in Cambodia. There are ones in Africa as well. These will build an anaerobic digestion chamber for people who often keep a small number of livestock, such as pigs and cows. So this is, if you like, more of a closed loop kind of farming biogas system of how things should work over here. So the manure that they collect from pigs and cows goes in on the top left. And then the anaerobic digestion chamber creates biogas, which can be used for clean cooking. Again, a bit like the Clean Cook Stoves. And then on the right there, you can get organic fertilizer coming out, which they can use to grow crops and farming there. So quite a nice closed environmental system there. You can go back to the previous slide, please. And this project here is one of those biogas projects in Cambodia. Now, this project's done some really good market research quantifying the benefits of this project, and they actually went to measure the indoor air pollution in biogas kitchens moved to biogas. And from those measurements, they found an 88% reduction in particulate matter, PM2.5. Now, PM2.5 is the stuff that they talk about when you talk about diesel engines over here and any smoke kind of dirty fuel. The scary thing about PM2.5 is you can breathe it in and it won't cause any damage to you for years or decades even, and then it will start to give you some adverse health effects. And the other thing there is that children are really vulnerable to PM2.5 because they have smaller, more susceptible lungs when they breathe it in. So the benefits there of 88% reduced indoor air pollution are really significant benefit, wider benefit for Clean Cook Stoves and these clean biogas cook stove projects there. They also quantified the fuel saving, the money savings, sorry. So this one saved $143 per year per household on cooking fuels. Now, Cambodia, they're not particularly wealthy, so that's a really valuable share of their income. And they've got other various stats of 117 minutes time saved per household there, 250,000 tons of wood saved for this project, etc. We move on 2 slides, please. And then the Woodland Code. So I thought I'd put in the Woodland Code because it gets a lot of interest. So the UK Woodland Code is a government-backed carbon offset scheme, UK-based tree planting projects. Most of the projects are in Scotland because of land. There has been massive interest in UK Woodland Code, and it might plant about 4 or 5 trees per tonne of carbon. Now, all the carbon offset credits that I've just shown you, those carbon emission reductions happened in the past. Essentially, that's how the vast majority of carbon offset schemes work. They have a vintage. It might be 2019, it might be as far back as 2012. But the carbon emission reduction happened in the past. They get certified, you come along and buy it afterwards. And there's a carbon neutrality standard that's called past 2060, and you can only use those historical emission reductions for statements of carbon neutrality. And the UK Woodland Code has requirements in there that you can't use UK Woodland Code credits for carbon neutrality unless the emission reduction has been certified and happened in the past. Now, it takes about 15-20 years for a tree that's planted to store meaningful carbon, which means if you plant a tree now, you won't get any certified carbon emission reductions for about 15-20 years onwards. So if you like, the other carbon emission, carbon offsets are historical emission reductions that happened in the past. Most of the UK Woodland Code ones, you plant a tree now or recently, and the carbon storage happens over X decades in the future. Now, they can be used for carbon neutrality. Essentially, you need to buy more than 100% of the carbon offset credits that you need. So if you needed 1,000 and you wanted to be carbon neutral, you'd have to use gold standard or VCS. If you want to use Woodland Code, you need to buy more than that 1,000 that you need. You can go on to the next slide, please. I'm running a bit low on time. Go to the next slide, please. So the Gold Standards commissioned some really excellent market research that if you're offsetting a lot of carbon, such as the embodied carbon of a building, these are the wider socio-economic and environmental benefits of a single tonne of carbon credit. Now, they commissioned this market research and aligned it around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they found that the biogas carbon credits have the widest, the largest extra social, economic and environmental benefit or value, if you like. So a tonne of biogas credits may cost £10, £12, and it has a wider value of about $465 per single tonne there. Now, this can be used to really amplify the wider environmental, social and economic benefits of offsetting, particularly if you've got a large building. If we go to the next slide, please. So for example, if you've got 10,000 tonnes of carbon to offset, you could really get into the $1 million plus extra socioeconomic value created there. Now, moving on, how much do carbon offsets cost? A really important question. Now, this is market research that's done every year. Of course, it's always outdated by a couple of years. There's been a big increase in demand of carbon offsets over the last few years. That doesn't necessarily mean the average price has changed. Now, what you can see here is on the left, you've got a large number of credits in the very low cheap end, less than $1 per tonne. And that's not really the end that anyone should be working in for a business, really. That's you can get some carbon credits for 20, 40 pence per tonne. So those credits are really not the end of the market that a business should be working in to do a credible carbon offset scheme. And remember, reduction has to be done before you resort to carbon offsets. But you can see about the 4 or 5 pounds a tonne there. That's quite a mid-range kind of price offsets there. And anything beyond £10 a tonne starts to get higher end prices there. And that's the profile of what a carbon offset costs to offset 1 tonne of carbon emission reduction there. If we move to the next slide, in terms of what it might cost to offset, these are around the embodied carbon of buildings. So the embodied carbon to make all the materials, the cement, the concrete, the bricks, the steel, transported to site, construction site energy, embodied carbon of construction waste, etc. Everything to get a building up to the point of PC, ready to move into. Now, if we had a 5,000 metre squared low-rise office building, so not the centre of a city, London, not a particularly high-rise building, it might have an embodied carbon of about 3,000 tonnes of CO2. Offsets at about £7.50 tonne would be £22,000 to offset that building. And then at the higher end, £20 a tonne, about £60,000 to offset the embodied carbon of that building. That kind of end of things would be using UK Woodland Code to bring into the story, as well as gold standard carbon credits. Now, the high-rise building, a 50,000 metre squared high-rise building, so the kind of ones you'd get in the central London, there's more embodied carbon per metre squared, so you might have 50,000 tonnes of embodied carbon, and you're looking at significantly larger sums, so 375,000 up to £1 million to offset that building, the remaining embodied carbon there. I think there's only one slide left, so hopefully almost in time. In summary, aligned with what Simon and Steve have said, that it's really essential to reduce the carbon emissions as a first step. That has to absolutely be the first step. So that's plan A. And then if you've done that and you want to fast track emission reductions through funding carbon reductions elsewhere, then that's when carbon offsets could be used there. Now, you need to take caution really in selecting the better carbon offset projects, and there are some with some great wider benefits, social, environmental, and otherwise there. So there are some great projects that can create some social, economic, and environmental value if you do it correctly. And that's the last slide.
Fantastic, thanks, Craig. I've got so many questions. We've got some questions flooding in. And just before I let you go, Craig, and dive into the questions, I'm just going to ask one question from Kai, who asks, why is offsetting so controversial?
I think it got tarred by greenwash in the noughties, so 2000, 2010 kind of range, that there were some companies that were double selling them. There were companies that weren't putting in the efforts to measure properly and reduce properly before using them. And that's kind of stuck since there. So there has been a massive increase in interest in carbon offsetting over the last 3 years. So it is gaining credibility back and efforts to improve everything behind the scenes since that 15 kind of years ago.
Okay, fantastic, thanks. And perhaps we'll pick up on that as well in a bit. In fact, I'll ask Simon in a moment. But Steve, can you just, the words mitigation and offsetting have been used today. And so I know that you told me very clearly that PROLOGIS is involved in mitigation, but to me it looks like offsetting. And I have to admit, I am slightly confused as to which is which. And does it matter? Does it not end up in absorbing carbon in some form, fixing carbon in some form or other? And so does it matter? Steve first, and I'll bring Simon in.
I'm slightly biased on this one.
That's
so
fine.
The issue is that you know, to offset, you have to meet a certain standard, as Craig has described, and it has to involve taking 1 ton of carbon, or stopping 1 ton of carbon going into the atmosphere. When we're dealing with mitigation, it doesn't meet that sort of standard or that criteria for checking, but effectively keeping rainforest standing does not only stop carbon being emitted through deforestation, but as we know, it also has a much bigger impact in terms of sequestration of carbon, i.e. sucking out the atmosphere through the trees and the soil and so on. And then if you're really going for it, then the bigger, best benefits around keeping rainforest standing is it's a massive sort of socio-economic benefit. So it's environmental, social, and economic, way beyond what you might be able to achieve out of certain carbon projects that are proper offsets. So the case for mitigation and a case for retaining rainforest is almost sort of unbeatable, but it's not a carbon offset.
Okay, so Simon, in that case, you can't claim that your building's a net zero carbon, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't do it because we had a net zero carbon ambition. So I think, sort of taking a step back, we did this because we saw that we had a residual embodied carbon footprint, and that if we wanted to make any claims about our buildings being sustainable, that we needed to own up to and deal with that. And we actually did quite a lot of research on different types of offsetting, different available credit systems. And the interesting thing about Cool Earth is it's kind of, I'd almost describe it as direct action. So we're going straight to the people making the savings, whereas with credits, you're bundling those savings up and turning it into something that you can trade, you can sell on. And fundamentally, they do the same thing. And Cool Earth had done a lot of work with auditors to look at and scientists to look at how much carbon was saved by keeping the rainforest standing. But because they're a charity, they chose not to spend money on the bookkeeping side of this to go down a tradable carbon credit route, because they wanted as much as possible of the donations that go to them to go straight to their work on the ground. And for us, we didn't see tradable carbon credits as a problem, but we quite liked the idea of working directly with somebody who was there doing something, because we went into it with a plan to do it for a very long time. It wasn't a one-off. It was the beginning of at least a 5-year relationship, which has turned into 12, and it's probably going to be 10 more.
Right, okay, interesting. So I mean, this leads into a question for Craig as well, which is sort of related, in as much that you showed the variation in cost, Craig, of different carbon offsets, going from, I don't know, 40 cents all the way up to I don't know, 20 pounds. Incidentally, Simon, how much do you pay? Do you even bother asking about a ton of carbon? Is that a wrong question to ask, or how do you work out? And I'll come back to Craig in just a moment. Is there a cost associated with what you do?
Yeah, there is. So Cool Earth operate on a per acre basis, and depending on where that acre is, they actually have different amounts of carbon sequestered. The cost is at the lower end of the range that Craig gave, but for us, that's where we get comfortable with the position of doing 5 times more. So we could pay more for a credit that could be more demonstrably robust, but then we'd be buying less of them, and whereas we're comfortable working with these guys and doing more.
So rather than paying $1, you could pay $5 and just do less. But you prefer to do $1 times 5.
Yeah, and I guess that's about believing in what it is, and that's where the direct relationship we have with Cool Earth helps us. If we were to go down an offsetting route, we try and seek that same relationship and long-term view, where rather than just buying whatever was cheapest on the day, as if it was a commodity.
Okay, so I'm kind of interested, and I'll go into this. There's a couple of questions around this, but Craig, I'll ask you first. We've got that range of costs. You're going from 40 cents up to whatever it was, $25. I mean, if a 40 cents offset is of gold standard, but what's wrong with it? I mean, I don't understand why you wouldn't just go ahead and buy that.
Sure.
And yet you kind of gave the impression on the graph, you almost gave me a value judgment, saying the lower cost stuff, it's like saying Primark isn't good clothes. Not that I buy some. And there might be another argument to say it's not good. But anyway, the point is you're making a judgment on cost as opposed to value. And I'd just like you to unpick that, unless you're telling me that 40 cents are not verified.
Yeah, sure. So it is a great question, and I don't think it just comes down to cost is higher value. And unfortunately, quite a lot of people do see that. And if you are offsetting through the UK Green Building Council framework, you have to report the cost of offsets. And I don't think it's a great indicator of value, because if someone needs 10, 20,000 tonnes of carbon, they're paying a lot less per tonne than if someone just needs 500 tonnes of carbon, because efficiencies of scales come in. They're buying the same projects. So it's not all about price. Prices vary for many reasons. So they are real projects, and different project developers that have different pricing models. It won't necessarily be the only income stream that project has. Some of them are commercial projects that have other income streams. Some of them are non-profits that cost more per tonne to buy anyway. So it's kind of market mechanisms as to why they vary to some extent. But then there is also a case of some projects are a lot more expensive to run than others. So if you can imagine, some projects require a lot of capital equipment to set up before even setting up a project, so it costs a lot more to get going. Some projects might be really cheap to get up and going. Some, such as renewables, are really cheap credits generally, and you can buy them generally very cheap. There is also a case of vintage. Even with gold standard credits, there might be some credits around from 2011, 2012. Now, I've always been very uncomfortable using credits that old and don't use credits that old. I think, they shouldn't be used by most organizations. They're getting very old now, and strictly speaking, it shouldn't matter because it's still a carbon reduction in the past. But last month, the University of Oxford released a carbon offsetting principles document, and they did indicate that the offset should be as new as possible. So it does come into the case that newer offsets.
It's kind of, when you say as new as possible, do you think anything older than 3 years? This isn't like wine. We're not talking about wine. They don't get better as we leave. Ideally as new as possible, but some of the best projects might still have credits 5 years old even. There is vintage. Yeah. So I'm going to keep going with you, Craig, just for a moment. So could Craig, this is a question from Owen Connick. Could Craig comment on carbon offset schemes which focus on emissions reduction, e.g. funding retrofit of UK social housing to reduce heating energy use. And this brings me on to sort of how do we focus on the UK here? And is one of the controversies that we're talking about is the fact that it's happening in Papua New Guinea when, you know, we really ought to be reducing carbon in our country around, for instance, you know, funding retrofit. Do you want to just, and I'll bring you all in on that, but that question about UK versus global. But Craig, do you want to just focus on that question first?
Sure. So currently there are no offset schemes like that in the UK. The only verified carbon offsets are the UK Woodland Code tree planting there. So they don't exist, but I know there's been plenty of discussions of local authorities and others considering kind of funds to fund UK-based emission reductions. Those won't be verified carbon offsets, but I think going back to the mitigation question as well, I think there are plenty of other wider carbon reductions that are really important as well. So it's not just about offsetting, but the offsets that you have to use at the moment to claim things such as net zero carbon or carbon neutrality, those kind of marks. But it's not possible to get a carbon credit for a project like that in the UK. It can only be UK-based tree planting.
And that doesn't count anyway, by the sounds of it.
No, you could set one up. But then again, yeah, someone could set one up. I imagine they'd be very expensive, but yeah, someone could have, in theory, set up a project, a UK-based project, if they wanted,
Steve,
which would take
sounds
years.
like, I mean, you're involved in, you know, with the Planet Mark, planet certification. You know, offsetting is not necessarily a part of that, is it? But it can be a part. Reduction is the key thing. But just talk us a bit about reduction, offsetting, just that journey that you take your customers on, and why offsetting can be seen as a good thing as well.
Sure thing. So the journey we take our customers on is really about building knowledge inside their own organisation and getting systems in place where carbon reduction becomes, you know, straightforward and the way of doing business. And in and around carbon reduction, all sorts of other amazing things happen, particularly sort of wider areas around environment impacts and wider areas around social sustainability. So as soon as you start to activate people inside organisations and wider stakeholders, there is increased motivation to tackle much bigger sustainability sort of challenges and building that into the company's purpose. So that's the type of stuff that we do. So number one is the annual carbon reduction we see as a no-brainer. It's totally possible and it's really good for business to do that. Then you can start to set more aggressive targets around, you know, maybe carbon neutral, climate positive, or zero carbon. Each one of those then means you have to have a plan in place to get your carbon down as low as possible, including in your supply chain, or certainly for zero carbon, but offsetting is still a piece of that. So we're now talking much more about, you know, going beyond carbon reduction, setting zero carbon targets, and then talking about, you know, good quality offsetting and how you might do that. So it's come back into the mix in a much bigger way, and that's being met by better standards and better scrutiny of the whole offset market. I think that to the piece around, look, can you do stuff in the UK? I think we should be doing stuff in the UK anyway. There might be other funding models for that. If you're looking at trying to offset on a retrofit program in the UK, those carbon credits would be massively expensive. So that might just be the way it is, and that might be a great thing to do. And there may be a program for that and a mechanism. But a ton of carbon is in the UK is a ton of carbon anywhere else on the planet. So we just need to reduce carbon, and also we need to mitigate it or offset it. We're looking for the schemes that give you the biggest bang for the buck. Yeah. So, you know, what Simon is doing could have, you know, sort of done his mitigation program on a 1-to-1 basis. They say it's not good enough. We want to do it on a 1-to-5 basis. So we're going to say 5 times the amount we could do, because that's a good thing we can do. There's a really important point here, though, which is about what sort of organisation are you, and what is, you know, aligning this with your purpose. This is your opportunity to stand out as an organisation, say, this is our position on society and the environment. We're doing everything we possibly can. In fact, we're going above and beyond. And those organisations are the ones actually through this year are outperforming others on the stock market. We know that brands who've got purpose at the very heart are outperforming those that don't. There's an opportunity to do that here.
Okay, so Simon, I'm just interested in your view on global versus local, I mean UK, but just I've got a question here that I want to put into the mix of that as well, which is a client-based question. So Chris Carroll asks, at say a typical 1 ton a meter squared of embodied carbon, right? So that's the embodied carbon for building, typically, let's say, for a current do nothing scheme, and then a £10 per tonne offset levy. That's about 0.5% of the construction cost. At these pricing levels, is the incentive high enough to do the primary goal of driving down embodied carbon emissions in the first instance? So I think what Chris is asking is it so cheap to offset that someone like you just doesn't bother, you know? Because it's only 0.5%. That's actually quite a big margin. But anyway, and then just talk a bit about the global versus local.
Yeah. Well, the global versus local bit first. I mean, as I said at the beginning, we're a global company. So actually, it feels almost more natural for us to be thinking on global scale than it would do to restrict ourselves to the UK. And I think Steve's point about what can you do with your investment is the main one really. And you know, a few years ago we were at sort of 40, 50, 60 pounds a tonne with local authorities trying to establish carbon pricing in the UK. And that means, you know, it's all good, but it means you can achieve a lot less. And what we set out to do many years ago was this ongoing relationship, saving the rainforest where we possibly could, and then establishing that as a proper program. And we could really only do that globally. And then I think to the second question, I mean, it is quite an interesting one, and it's back to, I think, the question that was put to Craig at the beginning about why is offsetting controversial? Because, you know, if you start to get into a mindset where you can simply buy your way out of trouble without having made the effort to reduce your impact in the first place, then that's where it begins to be problematic. And my personal view is that we don't need to make it expensive artificially to avoid that. We just need to have scrutiny, transparency, and businesses being seen to do the right thing. So for us, in the context of our purpose and our business, our view would be that for operational emissions, our long-term trajectory is zero carbon through energy efficiency and on-site renewables. For embodied carbon, is continuous reduction through good design, but for the bit that we can't get rid of, to voluntarily go away and do our program of rainforest protection.
So that's kind of interesting. I think you're responsible developer, Simon, you guys. I mean, not every, or let's put it this way, some developers are less responsible, slightly more unscrupulous than you. And I'm just picking up a comment from Christopher Blust, who has, and I'll read it out in full, arguably why we are in such a carbon hungry society is due to materials being cheap and labour being expensive. This promotes a model of use where new materials are cheap, whereas recycled materials are highly expensive because they take more time to recycle. How can we break this model? How can you break this sort of chain? And is this where a carbon tax should be applied to new materials to make building material reuse much more viable from a financial perspective? So that's kind of putting rather than trusting the developer, Simon, that's saying you can't trust developers, you can trust PROLOGIS, but not many others, right? And actually what we're going to do is put a financial incentive in the system to ensure that developers do the right thing. So I'll bring Craig in a moment, but just Simon, because I can see Craig does lots of work around the circular economy, so it'd be fascinating to hear his answer. But Simon, why don't you just sort of tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth in that. I think that the market in recycled materials hasn't advanced in the way that it ideally should have. We've done lots of work around reuse of steel, and we always try and use recycled aggregates where they're available near our development sites, and that hasn't come through as much as it should. So there is probably something there in terms of market dynamics. I mean, the difficulty with these sort of ideas about carbon taxes and minimum floor prices is the unintended consequences that they create. And I think from my perspective, I would always sort of caution against over-regulating a situation, because, you know, what I think our ask of the world would be for people to go and just do something. And, you know, that if we had faced a lot of regulation and red tape, we perhaps wouldn't have gone down the route that we did do, and we wouldn't have achieved the good that we have over the last few years. So yeah, I think that would be my view. Is don't let, we have a saying about not letting perfection get in the way of success, and I think this might apply in that situation.
Right. Okay. Craig, I know you're itching to come in on that because of your other background, but there's also a question in here that you can put into that mix, is from Steve Dixon. He says, do you find that manufacturers of materials and equipment are responding well to the need to provide values of embodied carbon? So I know you're doing a lot of work in that, but answer those two questions.
Yeah. So on the carbon tax, and linked to the previous question as well, as if carbon offsets are expensive enough, I think I would like to see something like a carbon tax, or a bit further, even a resource tax. It's not just about carbon, but it could, I guess there's lots of implications of that, but it would be great if it could help stimulate such things such as deconstruction rather than demolition. So if you imagine there's a massive carbon resource tax on new materials, it would get people really thinking about retaining structure and deconstruction rather than demolition from a more closed loop, long timeline perspective. So massively complicated there. In terms of if carbon offsets are expensive enough, you said perhaps 0.5% of the build cost there. I think it's important to appreciate that they are voluntary carbon offsets, so they're not compliance-based offsets. So developers are choosing to use their own funds to buy them at the moment there. So they have been criticised for being too cheap, and Simon mentioned some values, 40, 50, 60 pounds a tonne there. Those are values that go around of what offsets could cost to incentivise people to do more. But I guess if that was on a voluntary basis, then even less people would use them. In terms of manufacturers, there are now a lot of manufacturers putting out embodied carbon values of their products. So there's about 7,000 environmental product declarations. You are starting to see manufacturers release carbon neutral products, net zero carbon products, I think stimulated by the UK Green Building Council's net zero framework. So carbon neutral has been around a long time, but since the UK Green Building Council released their net zero, you've now got organisations such as Aggregate Industries have just released a lower embodied carbon and then zero carbon to offset.
And can you include that in your embodied carbon calculation then as a net, as a zero? You should report both. So you should report the lower embodied carbon. So let's say it's 30% lower embodied carbon, and then you should also report the amount that's offset, but that's not established practice of how to report that at the moment. So there needs to be some development of reporting both, I'd say. Okay, really interesting. One of the questions, I'll ask Steve this, and this cuts to that, remember that sort of 5-step process you showed about the UKGB, is it 4 or 5? I forget how many steps. Five. And with offsetting being the last one, do you think, and this sticks with the whole thing about regulation and also ensuring that offsetting doesn't fall into the trap that it fell into 10, 15 years ago, should there be some form of certificate that before you can declare or before you can buy offsets, you've actually got to show you've made reductions? And somehow there's or even if there's an assurance scheme that says that you can't declare this building to be net zero unless it's assured, and you can't achieve that unless you met certain reductions in embodied carbon, for instance. What do you think about that as a way forward?
I think that's implicit in what the UK GBC are putting out. And then we are talking to the UK GBC about playing a role in that, and it is absolutely necessary. And I think it just needs to be really, really clear. That hierarchy is clear, and that is one of the issues that we had with offsetting, 2 decades ago, which is that actually you can go around driving a massive gas guzzler and just offset your way out of it, and that's not the solution. So what we've got now and what's very, very different is a few things. One is that there's a sort of a framework which has got into place that people are getting behind. There is momentum behind this UK GBC piece, but in that space, we're just part of a much, much bigger community chasing after net zero carbon, because actually the world's waking up to the issues that we've got. So if you think about and extrapolate that out for any sort of organization that you're working for any brand, or if you're in the supply chain of a company, net zero carbon will be setting the parameters about how we're going to operate, and it will become business as usual. Now, we don't wait for compliance to get on top of that, do we? We take action now and then move forward in the way that Simon has, because they're ahead of the game.
Yeah, there's a question that came up earlier around operational carbon, right? So let's assume you want to declare yourself net zero in operational. Can you buy that ahead of time, or do you have to? What happens? You kind of take a 50. Could Simon do a carbon neutral, zero carbon, net zero carbon in operation by buying offsets ahead of time?
The offsets then become, it's just one of the suite of activities you have to do in net zero. So if you're looking at operational, and this is why, this conversation is so important from an office portfolio or commercial real estate portfolio, you're saying, well, how do we get to net zero? So number one is you're looking at scope 1 and 2 emissions and reducing those to zero, which is by reducing operational carbon, plus also using renewable energy in scope 1 and 2. Then you look at your supply chain, which is your scope 3 emissions, and you determine if that's 45% or more of your overall carbon footprint, i.e. is it material or not? And if your materiality is in your supply chain, then you have to tackle your supply chain issues. And then only then do you start to deploy offsets. But you deploy offsets, like Craig has said, which are against a known standard, and they are good carbon offsets that are generally doing what they should be doing on the tin. So do you see what I'm meaning about the zero carbon in terms of operation? There are a series of steps you have to take and then do offsetting, and then that guards against any sort of, greenwash.
Yeah, okay, fine. There's a couple of comments I'll just bring people's attention to. So Gary Stokes makes a good point. Make recycled materials tax-free, and new materials just tax them as normal, and that's his VAT. Obviously, that makes a big difference. And then Chris Carroll just puts a note on about a British Land scheme, their offsetting scheme, where they have a price point which is made up of a gold standard credit plus uplift for decarbonizing their existing estate. So I guess that means that it's a way of justifying investment into their own estate. So yeah, interesting thoughts. Can we just bring up the poll, Bryony, again? I'm just interested to see if anyone changed their minds on this. So this is the offsetting piece. So a couple of questions. Do you agree that offsetting should be part of achieving a zero carbon solution? And then we've got the second question, just two questions in this poll. Do you have, or will you be setting a zero carbon target for your business? Incidentally, while we're waiting for people to answer that, Simon, do you have a zero carbon target for your business? Have you been bold enough to say you're going to achieve that by a certain time?
So we've got, globally, we have a science-based target, which is the sort of, the evolution of that thinking, that you need to look at what you do as a component of global industry and figure out what is the right amount of reduction for you to achieve and by when. So that's all visible on our global website, prologis.com. But yeah, we've got targets, and certainly our target, boiling that down to local level, is that all of our developments, and this has been the case for the last 10 years, are effectively going beyond a net zero position in terms of the construction footprint of the building, and we're hoping to get to net zero in operation. And again, it's about how you define that, but we'll do it by reference to the building regulations and regulated energy use. But we're hoping to get to that position very soon if we can start to get the on-site renewable component of things working effectively within the energy industry.
Okay, that's really interesting. So that poll, everyone can see it now, which is kind of, yeah, there we go, we've fixed it. So no more don't knows. So everyone's made a decision, so that's very good. And in fact, we did have, I think, 11 no's, and we had 14 or 15 don't knows. And now, admittedly, there's a few people have jumped out, got bored of the conversation, jumped out, but there you go, their loss. We've actually persuaded everyone, we don't know it's direct, but we persuaded enough people to say, yes, offsetting's okay. We persuaded them of the case. And then do you, or will your business be having a zero carbon target? And the majority of organizations left the saying, Yes, they will. Well, a few of you not, actually. That's kind of interesting. I wonder why you are not having a net zero carbon target. Perhaps it's not appropriate for you. So look, we've just got a couple of minutes yet. And I left and I just thought we'd just go round the table, just talking about, next steps, just reflections on this conversation from an offsetting. Do you see offsetting as being a non-controversial part of the future of achieving zero carbon, and is it part of your, how are you going to contribute to that journey? So let me start off with Craig on that one, that question, then I'll go to Steve and then Simon.
So I think if done correctly, if you're absolutely focusing on plan A of reduction and a commitment to reduce over timeline as well, that's when to use carbon offsets appropriately. So that's really has to be how to do the carbon offsets properly.
And one supplementary question that I'll ask each of you is, what can the BCO do to help?
The second part of that question, sorry, the first question is, I think offsets are really well aligned for embodied carbon, making zero because there are massive limits, as was said earlier by Simon, to making embodied carbon lower compared to operational carbon. So they're really well aligned, particularly for embodied carbon, which is just very, very, very difficult to make zero otherwise. What the BCO can do, well, this webinar is a great start of discussing more about the carbon offsets to help people understand them, because I think there is misinformation about them and people don't realise the wider benefits of, if you pick some of the better projects, of how to use them there. So perhaps the next steps, UK Green Building Council are doing lots of net zero, so being involved in that somehow would be probably a good step.
Great. Steve, perhaps you'll tell us about any technical note that you might be doing with the BCO as well.
So I think just firstly, offsets are part of the sort of the carbon climate mix. They're here to stay. They're back. They're here to stay for the time being, and they'll be crucial within the next 9 years. I think looking around us, we've got an enormous increase in climate and carbon literacy and understanding that we're in a transformational time and we will have a role to play. And I think that movement is taking hold and is here. What people need to see is change. So what could the BCO do in terms of change? Increase, carbon literacy and knowledge in this way. Let's have more of this. But what commitment can you make as an organisation, as an entity, to take all of your members, including those 5 who said they won't go zero carbon, which would be fascinating to understand why, because we want to make the case really, really appealing. What can the BCO do to take all of its members zero carbon and help them do it, and then cascade that out, up the supply chain and down to the customer base?
Yeah, perhaps you should ask everyone to make their own and make public all their members zero carbon proposals.
Last week, that's what happened. 200 corporations put it in the public domain.
200. I find that a bit disappointing. I know you're saying it's 200, but it doesn't seem very many to me. But anyway, let's not. Simon.
That's one organisation.
I know. Simon.
Yeah. So from our perspective, we're going to keep going with the program that we have for the next 10 years. We've expanded it into Europe, and I hope to expand it further. And I think coming back to what Craig has just said, I think for us, the embodied carbon as a developer, but even if we're just refurbishing existing buildings, there's still embodied carbon being emitted there, and that's the stuff that's very hard to tackle another way. And I think if we weren't pursuing an offsetting or mitigation route for that embodied carbon, we'd be missing an opportunity. There's a hell of a lot of good that could be done by businesses out there, just actually getting on and trying this, because there are good causes out there. Coolers, tremendously good cause. A lot of the carbon offset schemes are doing really good work, and so putting our shoulder to that as an industry and trying to help. I mean that would be my ask of the BCO. Actually, is I think UK GBC are championing a zero carbon definition, and they're having a go at that. And I think BCO really just putting their shoulders to this and trying to drive people in the industry to do something will achieve some tremendous good.
Fantastic, good. Okay, and I know the 3 of you are contributing to a technical note, a briefing note that Simon probably doesn't know that actually, but you'll be asked.
Okay.
Just for a case study. So everyone will be sent that briefing note that Craig and Steve are going to author over the next few weeks. Good. So without further ado, let me thank our panelists. So thank Thank you, Steve, very much. Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Simon, for such a very good and enjoyable discussion. And thank you everyone else for turning up. Really good hour and a quarter. And we'll see you at the next BCO session. Goodbye.